There is a state in western Mexico called Jalisco. Its capital, Guadalajara, is one of the largest cities in the Americas. Universities, cathedrals, colonial plazas, a metropolitan population of over 5 million people. The architecture is Spanish Baroque. The street names are Spanish. The legal system descends from Spanish colonial law. If you stood in the center of Guadalajara today and looked around, you would be looking at a world that was built on top of another world, and the world beneath it is almost invisible now. But in 1540, on the mesa country north and west of where that city now stands, something happened that the Spanish Empire did not expect and was not prepared for. The people they had come to rule rose, and for 2 years they nearly won. These are not just different stories about the same territory. They are different understandings of what it means to belong to a place and what a people owes that place when it is threatened. The conventional account of Spanish colonization in western Mexico runs something like this. After the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, Spanish authority spread outward across the continent in steady, if sometimes violent, waves. Missionaries followed soldiers, mines were opened, towns were founded. Indigenous peoples were incorporated into the colonial order, some by force, some by conversion, some by the slow pressure of Spanish administration. The Mixtón War appears in this account as a disruption, a complication, what Spanish sources call a rebellion. The word is revealing. A rebellion assumes a prior legitimate authority being defied. It assumes the Spanish were already in charge, and the Caxcan and their allies were breaking a law already established. Maps of this era show the Spanish colonial world expanding outward from Mexico City in clean jurisdictional lines. New Galicia to the northwest, New Spain to the south. The territory is labeled, bounded, administered. The indigenous nations living within those lines are listed as subjects, as converts, as labor, categories in a colonial bureaucracy. From inside this framework, the Mixtón War looks like an episode of disorder that was eventually corrected. Spain suppressed the uprising, consolidated its authority, and the expansion continued. That is how the story ends in most accounts, with Spanish control restored. What this account cannot explain is why tens of thousands of people chose to fight, and why they came so close to winning. The people at the center of the Mixtón War were primarily the Caxcan, along with Zacatec, Tecuexe, and other nations of what the Spanish called the Gran Chichimeca, the vast semi-arid north of central Mexico, a region of mesa landscapes, canyon country, and high plateaus where the Spanish encountered something they had not expected. People who had never been incorporated into the Aztec tributary system, who had no tradition of submission to distant authority, and who had developed a way of life precisely adapted to the demanding terrain they occupied. The Caxcan did not govern through a single centralized king. Their political authority was organized through community leaders, through relationships between settlements, through shared spiritual understandings about the land and its obligations. Their territory was not abstract, it was specific. These canyons, these mesas, this water source, this planting ground, these shrines. When the Spanish arrived in the 1520s and 1530s, they brought with them a practice they called encomienda, a system in which indigenous people were entrusted to Spanish colonists who were entitled to their labor and tribute in exchange for their supposed spiritual welfare. In practice, it meant forced work in mines and on Spanish estates, the destruction of traditional authority structures, and the imposition of Christianity over existing spiritual practice. For the Caxcan and their neighbors, this was not a tax or an inconvenience. It was an assault on the coherence of their world. The encomienda did not just take labor, it severed the relationship between people and place, between living and the obligations that living in a particular landscape required. The spiritual dimensions of the Caxcan resistance were inseparable from the political ones. prophets and ritual specialists moved through communities in the years before the war, declaring that the old world could be restored, that the ancestors supported the struggle, that the land itself was calling its people back. This was not superstition, it was a political theology, a framework for collective action grounded in specific understandings of who these people were and what their relationship to their homeland meant. The first significant Spanish entry into Caxcan territory came in the 1520s. The encounters were marked almost immediately by misreading on both sides, but the consequences of misreading fell almost entirely on the Caxcan. Spanish commanders read Caxcan resistance to encomienda as ingratitude, as savagery, as evidence that these people were less civilized than the Mexica of central Mexico, and therefore required more severe handling. They did not read it as a principled defense of a political and spiritual order. They could not, within their own framework, recognize it as such. The Caxcan read Spanish demands as a temporary imposition that could be negotiated or endured until an opportunity for resistance arrived. What they perhaps underestimated was the degree to which the Spanish system was not interested in negotiation. It was interested in transformation, in remaking the people and the landscape into something the colonial order could administer. By the late 1530s, abuses in the encomienda system in western Mexico had become severe enough that even some Spanish officials complained, but the complaints produced no significant reform. The pressure continued. In 1540, it broke into open war. The Mixtón War began in the canyon country of Jalisco and spread rapidly. Caxcan fighters, joined by allies from neighboring nations, fortified the natural mesas and promontories of the region, places they called pañoles, high rocky outcroppings that provided natural defensive positions. They used their knowledge of the terrain with devastating effectiveness. The first Spanish military response, led by colonial governor Cristobal de Oñate, was repulsed. A second campaign, commanded by Pedro Alvarado, one of the most experienced and brutal of the original conquest-era commanders, ended in catastrophe when Alvarado was killed at the Battle of Nochislan in June 1541. A Spanish force was routed. Indigenous allies of the Spanish deserted. For a period, the colonial administration of Western Mexico genuinely feared collapse. The Spanish response was to escalate on a scale that had not been seen in the region. The Viceroy of New Spain, Antonio de Mendoza, led a massive military force personally, an army that included thousands of indigenous allies from central Mexico, Tlaxcalan warriors, and Spanish soldiers into the Caxcan heartland. The pañoles fell one by one. The communities that had supported the war were subjected to extreme reprisals. By 1542, organized resistance was suppressed, but the war's consequences extended far beyond its military conclusion. What the Mixtón War broke was not merely a political arrangement, it broke a world. The Caxcan ceremonial traditions that had sustained the resistance, the prophetic movements, the ritual structures through which communities had maintained their coherence, were targeted with particular intensity in the aftermath. Missionaries moved into the region with colonial military support. Temples and sacred sites were destroyed or built over. The conversion of Caxcan and neighboring peoples was enforced as policy. The Caxcan language, Caxcana, gradually disappeared from documentary record. The sophisticated knowledge systems it encoded about land, water, seasons, governance, spiritual obligations had no equivalent representation in the colonial language that replaced it. The pañoles, where Caxcan fighters had made their stand, became, over subsequent centuries, tourist sites, geographic curiosities, or quarry locations. The specific memory of what happened there, of why people climbed those rocks and what they were defending, largely survived in oral traditions of descendant communities rather than in official historical narratives. And yet, the land remembers what the archives do not. The canyon country of Jalisco and Zacatecas still holds the geography of that resistance in its topography. The mesa outcroppings are still there. The water sources the Caxcan defended are still there. The names given to those places in Caxcana, most of them, are not. The state of Jalisco today operates under Mexican federal law, which derives from a colonial legal tradition that traces its origins to the same Spanish imperial system the Caxcan fought to resist. Indigenous communities in the region, including descendant communities of the nations that participated in the Mixtón War, navigate a legal landscape in which their land claims, governance structures, and cultural practices are recognized partially and inconsistently by a state whose foundations rest on the colonial settlement that the war failed to prevent. The Wisharitari people of the Sierra Madre Occidental, whose territory borders the historical Caxcan region, have maintained continuous ceremonial and land-based practice for centuries, resisting incorporation into colonial and then national systems of land tenure. Their pilgrimage routes, their sacred sites, and their governance traditions represent a living indigenous legal and spiritual framework operating in the same territory where the Mixtón War was fought. Not identical to Caxcan tradition, but descended from the same deep roots of Western Mexican indigenous life. Their land is under continuous pressure from mining concessions, agricultural expansion, and tourist development. The negotiation between their framework and the Mexican state's framework is not resolved. It is ongoing. Return to Guadalajara. To the cathedral built on the memory of a world the Spanish came to replace. To the street names that record a history of arrival without recording what was already there. To the legal system whose foundations reach back through colonial law to the same imperial framework that sent soldiers into the Caxcan highlands in 1540. The Mixtón War was not a rebellion against legitimate authority. It was a defense of a legitimate authority that the Spanish chose not to recognize. A political and spiritual order grounded in specific relationships to specific land, that the colonial system could not incorporate and therefore sought to eliminate. This was not civilization replacing savagery. It was one civilization overriding another, and then writing the history as if the one it replaced had never fully existed. The question is not whether to restore what was lost. Much of what was lost cannot be restored by an act of will. The question is whether we are willing to read the landscape honestly, to see in those mesa outcroppings and canyon walls not simply scenery, but the remnants of a world that fought for its right to continue. This is Before America. If you want to understand the continent beneath the continent, the worlds that existed before the maps were redrawn, stay with us. There is much more to uncover.